start. So I want to talk about reproduction, because all living things got to reproduce. It's actually sort of redundant, because part of living is reproducing. And there are two major types. Number one is asexual. That is the ancestral type. That is, the original organisms all reproduced asexually. In shorthand, you reproduce by yourself. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to that. That is, you don't need a partner. Okay, so that at a population density of 1, you can reproduce, whereas animals that use, or organisms that use sexual reproduction need 2 individuals. It produces what's called a clone. That is approximately genetically identical offspring. We'll talk about some examples. But you experienced a clone back in Bio 111 when you grew those little colonies of bacteria way back when. One bacterium landed, and it reproduced and produced a pile of bacteria that were genetically identical to it. Now, maybe there's a few mutations, but not enough to worry about. That's a clone. There was no mating involved. All those are genetically identical to the original. When they talk about human cloning, the notion is producing a human that is genetically identical to you. So that's different from regular reproduction where, like, my son is a mix of genetics from both genes from both me and my wife. So in the case of a clone, it's genetically identical. And so, for example, in bacteria and yeast and a lot of other simple organisms, you have one cell, and it grows, and it becomes larger, and then it divides into 2 smaller cells. Okay? All right. There are other examples besides that. Another one is grass, and many plants do this. If you have, here's the dirt, here's the air, here's your grass plants and little roots down below. The roots grow over and they sprout up. So basically the roots, you start with your plant here, and the roots grow over, make some more roots, and then they sprout up new plants. And then let me write that a little more neatly. Sorry about that. And so to a first approximation, the grass in my backyard is more or less of a clone. Right? That is, it's spread, or it's, because it's called vegetative propagation. The roots grow down and sprout up. There's not a mom and dad grass involved, and that grass is all genetically identical. So it's a clone of grass in my backyard. And a final example for animals, hydra. Hydra is a 2-millimeter tall animal. They're kind of cool little freshwater animals. Hello? All right. That was weird. All right. So underwater, that's unusual. All right. I don't think it was somebody in class. I don't know. All right. Okay. All right. Anyway, so the hydra is this little tiny animal, and they reproduce by budding. So like a bud grows and drops off. So now you have the dirt again, your old hydra, and you got a new little baby hydra growing. Right. All right. And again, the thing that they have in common with all of these is that they're genetically identical to the original one. And one plant of grass can make many, doesn't need a pair. One bacterium can make many bacteria. One hydra can make many. Right? So there's asexual reproduction, which is common in the world for a variety of different organisms, and it has some advantages. That is, you don't need a partner, as I said above. Right? Therefore, it's good at low population density. That is, if there was one last human on Earth, that's the end of the human race. But if you could reproduce asexually, then one last bacterium on Earth, that bacterium can still reproduce. Right? So that's an advantage. There's a disadvantage of this, however, is that all the kids look the same as the parents. Therefore, there is little variation, leaving aside mutation. And the result is they are therefore vulnerable to environmental changes, predators, disease, etc. So the advantage of asexual reproduction is if you find the best genotype, you copy millions of copies of it and you take over. The problem is times change. So what might be the best genotype today could be really lousy tomorrow. So for example, you've covered the world. The classic example in the case is an unnatural example. Humans have bred animals and plants for crops that are sort of the optimal pig and the optimal corn, for example. And we try our best to clone them, because once you found the best producing pig, the best tasting pork, or whatever, the best tasting corn, you don't want to mess it up. You want to clone it, reproduce it exactly the same. So all the corn, to a first approximation grown in the United States, is the same genotype, because everyone wants to grow the best one. However, if a fungus comes along that infects that corn, it can kill all of the corn in the United States. Right? Or if a disease comes along, or there's some predator or something, or likewise with pigs, if they're all genetically identical, then something that kills one of them can kill all of them. And that's not a stable situation. That's actually one of the things people worry about who think about these things, is that there's not a lot of genetic diversity. So you have the advantage. You can be the very best. But like I said, times change, and what can be best today might be worse later on. And so what happened over time is that a different kind of reproduction evolved, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. And that's the second one which I want to talk about, which is sexual reproduction. That evolved about 1,000 million years ago, right? 1 billion years ago-ish. You need two individuals. We call them parents, but they're not always, as we'll see in a little bit, male and female. It's usually males and females, but not always. It's a weird and interesting world out there. Each contributes some genetic material which is combined to produce the offspring. All right? And the singular advantage of that, or the trade-off you make, is that you can mix traits. My kids are a mixture of me and my wife, which leads to more variation, but you risk losing the best genotype. Therefore, it's a trade-off. So if you think about So the trouble with sexual reproduction, which is why is that if you have this super genotype, you got to mate with somebody else. And if you've got the very best genotype, they probably have one that's a little bit not as good, and your kids are going to be somewhere in between. So if you're trying to breed the very best, asexual reproduction is definitely the way to go. Except, again, what I said, what's best today is not necessarily best tomorrow, and you don't know what the future will hold. And so it turns out in most cases to be an advantage to trade away having the very best genotype for having more variation, because then your species will survive. Right? So that the humans reproduce sexually, if you look around the room, there's enormous diversity of humanity. And so it's really quite difficult for one disease to wipe all of us out, because we're going to have different susceptibilities to that because we mixed, all of us are a result of mixing genes from our parents. Questions about the differences between those two and like the pluses and minuses? Yeah?